Great. So hello and welcome. My name is Anna Rose Keefe. I am a textile conservator based in Rhode Island with a passion for repair and craftsmanship. And today I am going to talk to you about what to do when you get a hole in your sock. I have got a couple different examples right here. Most of these are winter socks, wool socks. I feel like we've all been inside for a while, wearing our cozy footwear, getting a lot of use out of our sort of favorite socks. So I want to talk about kind of what happens when your heel develops a hole. So we are going to cover just how to darn these. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is darning eggs. Some of you may have, beautiful antique darning eggs that you've inherited. Others may not even know what a darning egg is. But the basic idea is that when you are repairing a sock, when you're repairing a three-dimensional thing like a heel, you need to have something that occupies that space and keeps it sort of softly curved as you work. If I were to, here is there. If I were to just grab the two edges of this hole, push them together and repair them with a whip stitch, I would create something kind of bulky that might wind up giving me blisters that might not be comfortable to walk on. So instead, what we're going to try and do is work back and forth and create new fabric, essentially, just using a needle and thread in the hole. And this is something we've done in other, darning and repair things, other videos you can find on the Cary Library YouTube page, examples of how just working back and forth with a needle and thread can fix holes in a way that doesn't distort the surrounding area. So for this sock right here, you can see I've already got something in there. And as I work, this will give me a nice surface where I can actually keep this three-dimensional, I can keep it curved, and then my stitches won't be so tight that they either bunch up, and they won't be so loose that they sort of hang out of the weave structure. So I have got a couple different options for things you can put in your heels to hold the shape while you work. This is just a little plastic egg. If you have Easter eggs left over, they are honestly the perfect thing to use. A plastic Easter egg is an amazing darning egg. So that's what I'm going to be using. From Jean, yes, we are going to turn our sock inside out when you work. Whatever is face up when you're working is going to be the less noticeable side. Yes, so if you want a beautiful artistic darn, I would totally encourage you to work with it sort of not turned inside out, right side out, but I want to show you how to make maybe a more subtle darn. Even though I'm working in a contrasting thread, the idea is that this is going to be a little less noticeable. So this right here is a fun antique darning egg I found at a thrift store. It's also a needle case. When you turn the top, eventually you can align these little holes with various different chambers inside the darning egg. So I can store my tiny needles in one, I can store my big yarn needle in another. So that was a fun little thing I found. This is a pretty classic darning egg. It's got a handle, which is great. Because all of these are very soft, very smooth surfaces, they will slide around if you're not careful. I will probably wind up adjusting mine a lot as we work. You might notice that. And if you have something with a handle, that can be easier because you can kind of hold on to the handle as you are stitching. So that's really nice. But it is a dark color, and a lot of my socks are dark. So it's very hard to see the hole through the sock. I want to be able to look through the sort of weaker areas and notice not only the hole, but what might be about to turn into a hole so that I can address both of these. So I don't wind up using this one unless I'm darning white socks, which I don't own a lot of. So we're not going to come back to this one, but the handle is great. This is a small paperweight I found. I was walking around my apartment last night. Basically anything egg-shaped you can use. I've also got a Christmas bell that would be ideal for darning a toe. Basically, you have to think about the shape of the sock, the space you want to inflate. And so if you have something small and circular that isn't necessarily a sewing tool, I would encourage you to use it. And then on the extreme end of that, I also have a lemon and a clementine. If you do not have any darning eggs, if you can't find a single thing, I would encourage you to go into your kitchen. If you're repairing a sock for somebody who's got a larger foot, a lot of darning eggs are going to be really small, particularly like a gym sock for a man where the heel might be blown out. You might wind up being kind of frustrated if you're using one of these sort of petite little antique darning eggs. And I would encourage you to go find a piece of fruit in that case. So there are both, you know, antique options we've got, there are very practical household options we've got, and there are fruit options if that is what you have on hand. So I would just say whatever works for you is perfect for this project. I have two identical wool socks right here. These both had very similar holes, and I'm going to slip my white plastic darning egg inside one and my wooden darning egg inside the other so that we can just check out the situation. So when you are looking, when you are observing, you want to identify the hole, and then you also want to identify if the area around the hole is also stable. I have got a cautionary tale right here. This sock that I repaired, you can see it's pretty thin in a lot of areas. I had a hole dead center, but then I also had this very weak area surrounding the hole, and I only fixed the hole. And what this means is that now in this top area, right above the hole, this is about to give. And what I'm going to wind up with is damage that far exceeds the original hole. This is going to cause me sort of more trouble in the long run to ignore the weak areas and just repair the hole. So you want to make sure that your repair goes beyond the edges of this hole to also catch any surrounding weak areas. I have got just a basic pretty fine wool thread. It's in a contrasting color so you can see it. But I do, for these socks, ironically have really good color matches. If I used these, I would probably be able to create a pretty invisible repair, but you wouldn't be able to see it on the hand cam. So instead I'm going to use an orange. I've started this already, and I started by going around just with a simple running stitch to outline the area that I was working in. When you're working on this, it can be a little hard to remember maybe where you originally agreed you were going to go. I think it's easier to just outline it, and then I don't have to think about like, oh, is that area kind of weak? Do I want to dip down there and catch that corner? If it's already outlined, you know where you want to stop. I think I saw a comment in the chat. Jill says, can you use embroidery floss if you don't have wool? You absolutely can, but I would think maybe twice before using a sewing thread rather than, you know, something softer. This is kind of stretchy, which I like. I would test your floss, and if it's really, if it has no recoil, if it has no bounce, then it might not be ideal for an area that's going to stretch a lot. I think if I had a hole in the footbed, embroidery floss could be perfect, but for a hole in the heel where I know I'm going to be pulling this over my foot, I just want to test whatever I'm using, and if it's got a little bounce, then I know it's good. Let's see. Pat says, was that thread rather than yarn you were using to match the socks? All of this is the same sort of darning wool thread that I bought, you know, years ago. I think I've used this in a couple other tutorials when we were repairing sweaters, but it is just a fine wool intended for embroidery or repair. The brand, it unfortunately doesn't have a brand. I bought it at a yarn shop called Wabi Sabi in Ottawa, Canada. But I think we've talked about how there are a couple things you can find on Etsy. La Laine St. Pierre might be a fine wool embroidery thread. And then if you also search for fine wool embroidery thread, I believe Piper's might carry a couple, or if you search for crewel work, I'm gonna type that into the chat right here, CREWEL, crewel thread, that is specifically wool embroidery. And so that's gonna be very similar to what I'm using right here. So for this, I don't want to use a knot when I get started. I've already started over here, but I have to sort of start a fresh row of stitching. And instead of using a knot, which would add bulk, which might sort of rub and annoy your foot, I am going to anchor my yarn over here in the corner, and I'm just going to stitch over until I am pretty near the hole where I want to start.
Anna Rose, we have
yes.
Jill has a question. We're still thinking about the thread, about
perfect.
If the wool thread will shrink in the wash.
So if you are working with a wool sock, I think it's probably going to be a good idea. I have shrunk these socks before in the wash. I wouldn't wash them on super hot. I wouldn't wash them on a sanitized cycle, but this should be fine. When you wash it, it might felt a little bit, and I think that would be good because felting is a little bit more dense, so I think it'll give you a little bit of added protection to the area. It would be a good idea for you to check if your thread is color fast. If it is sold as not, bleeding, the dyes won't bleed, that would be better, particularly if you were doing an artistic, sort of red repair on a white sock. You certainly don't want to throw it in the laundry and, dye all of your things bright pink. I see Irene has a question about how long the thread would be. When I work, I try to cut my thread about 18 inches. You can, of course, do it, much smaller, but my idea is that I never want my thread to be longer than my forearm. If I wind up stitching and I'm always pulling sort of far away, this is very tiring, and it's more likely to be, knot. Whereas if I'm just operating, moving from the elbow, I'm less likely to tire as I stitch for long periods of time. And so I never want my thread to be sort of longer than where my arm is going to move. Shorter is better if you don't mind, constantly restarting. You can work really fast if you have a shorter thread because you're not sort of bothering to pull it through. And if you have a little knot, you don't have to detangle anything. But I know that's not as popular as sort of a medium length that you can work quickly. So right here, you can see, I've got rows of running stitches already put in place. And these are just very simple over, under stitches. And what I'm doing as I go, I'm trying to alternate kind of like a basket weave. If I've gone sort of over in one area, on my next row of stitches, I'm going to try and make sure that in that spot I'm going under. And this just ensures.
Anna, can you turn your hand like horizontal so that we can see? I don't know if that's comfortable for you.
No, this is perfect. Mina is my wonderful camera person who reminds me when I'm using my hands to cover the camera. So I always appreciate that. So I am just kind of saving time, and I'm going to do the entire row before pulling through. I have already outlined my area and thread, knowing that if I cover this whole zone, we will be good. So I'm going to make it all the way to the other end, and then I'm going to come back. And when you get to the hole, you're not going to be able to go over under because you don't have anything to stitch into. So I am just going to stitch all the way, have a nice long float there until we reach the other end of the hole, and then just pull through.
Do you need to keep your stitches kind of loose so that they can stretch with the fabric?
Absolutely. I'm not pulling too tight. You can see maybe it's even a little bit extra loose on the edges. I do have a little bit of give in a lot of these stitches. And this is because as I wear this sock, I don't want my stitches to be so tightly tensioned that they yank on the rest of the heel that they might distort things. So of course, you don't want it to bunch up, but just keeping things pretty loose, not pulled too tightly, is going to be easier in the long run. So I'm just thinking over, under, as I work, alternating. And just letting those long floats go over the hole. Of course, I have to adjust my tail. There we go. And if you do feel like you've maybe stitched a little too tightly, you could always just gently tug on the surrounding area. Of course, if it's super fragile, you know, don't pull too much. But if you just sort of readjust so that your darning egg is firmly situated in the heel, you might find that the tension kind of takes care of itself. So I have already done this process. Jill says, did you secure it with a knot at the start? No. If you remember, I went in over here and then I just did a couple stitches until I got to this point. I have a nice long tail that I can now thread and maybe make a back stitch or two and cut off. But I feel like those back stitches are lower profile than a knot. And so I just think they'll be a little bit more comfortable to have, you know, rubbing up against my heel if I'm wearing tight shoes or something. I don't want to repair my sock just to make it uncomfortable in the long run. So I have already done this process on this sock right here. And you can see it's pretty densely filled in. I've put a lot of stitches into this area because it was pretty weak. I want there to be something so as I'm wearing it, it won't abrade the sock itself. And so once you have filled in all of your stitches in one direction, you need to turn and fill in all of your stitches in the other direction. So again, to that point, I'm not going to start with a knot. I am going to leave a tail that is long enough to thread and work in, and then I'm going to do 2 back stitches right here and right here. And then when I make those back stitches, I'm going to try and catch some of the wool yarn that I just added in because I know that the material I just added is more stable than the original blue that I'm trying to repair. So if I need it to grab onto something, what I just put in here is a better choice. And so then I am just going to make running stitches in the other direction. Again, just working over, under, over, under. And then as I come back, I'm going to go under where my first row of orange stitches is, and then I'm going to go over where there are no stitches. And this will just ensure that every area has something to work with. This might get pretty dense as you work. You might find that you are stitching into an area that already has a lot of thread. And I don't think that's a problem, but it can be a little cumbersome.
You're basically making sort of a weave.
Yeah, if it looks like a basket weave, then that is perfect. But what I am doing is like when you are weaving, I have laid down all of my yarn in one direction and now I'm going to do it in the other direction. And I think I might actually skip ahead to talk about this hole. So I'm just going to finish this off right here. And then ideally, keep your tail out of the way. You would keep filling this in, but I don't want to make you watch me do that. So I am just going to jump ahead a couple rows and go in here. And then the reason why I have been so focused on over under in all of these other spots is also because you need to make sure that you are reweaving this area. If you aren't conscious of laying sort of your stitches down in a pattern, then this will not look like fabric when you are done. So you can see I'm going over and under right here. And then this is where it gets kind of weird. This is where you might want to go a little bit more slowly because you really want to make sure that if you stitched over one of these in the last row, you're catching it in the next row. If you are a weaver, you can kind of use your needle to adjust these stitches into place. You know, instead of beating it down, you might just kind of use your needle to ensure that things are remaining in order. And as you work, this should also really look like a basket weave. And this is going to be an area where you are going to pack your stitches in pretty densely. So there are times where I might just take a single stitch if I'm trying to make sure that I've caught this. There are other times where I might be able to take slightly longer rows of stitching, but I'm using my needle as I go to push down and adjust all of this so that it fills the hole evenly and creates new material. I am going to set this aside. Jill says, Anna, is there ever a better time to put the needle through half of the thread? Maybe you could clarify what you mean by half of the thread.
So sometimes when I'm sewing sweaters and I'm finishing off the end or sewing the end in at, what am I trying to say? Yeah, the tail at the end. I go through half of the thread, the other in the other direction, so that it makes it more secure because it won't. What am I trying to say? So if the wool thread has like 6 pieces to it, I put the needle through halfway so that it is more secure. Do you know what I'm saying?
I absolutely do. That is what I did right here when I started this one. And I think that's a great technique. I wasn't really confident of my ability to kind of show it on Zoom, but you can kind of see I stitched through at least one of the two. Because this is just 2-ply.
So when you when you said stitching through, it's kind of like splitting the one that you're going through.
Yeah, absolutely. And then particularly if you weave in this tail, you've got a lot anchoring this so that you know it is nice and secure. I think that's awesome.
Okay.
Thank you. So the last thing I want to talk about is when a sock might be beyond repair. And so I brought one sock right here that I probably shouldn't have even purchased because I knew it was made from something that would be cozy, but that wouldn't wash well, that wouldn't be durable at all. But you know, it was cute for a while. So you can see through the weave structure, through the knit structure right here, and you can really see how much of this is sort of worn away. I could, in theory, you know, just darn all of the toe area. I could darn the footbed. I could darn the bottom of the heel. I could darn the heel itself. I could darn the back of the heel. I think on one of these, there's also some abrasions on the side. But if you are basically resoling a sock, I would say that it might be time to let that go. And then instead, one thing my mother does, I think can be really great, is you can turn these socks into arm warmers. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I am going to cut the toe off. We'll find another use for that somehow. And then I am going to cut the heel off. Right there. And then I'm going to have a little hand warmer. So this is one thing I will do with my old socks. I was talking to my uncle earlier this week, and he was saying when he has white cotton gym socks, he will cut off right above the heel, and then he'll wear them around his wrist when he's cycling, which does double duty of both sort of maybe helping people see your arm when you hold it up to turn, and then he'll also use it as kind of a sports handkerchief. Because particularly when you're cycling in the winter, sometimes you get a little sniffly, and if you're moving fast, you don't want to dig for a Kleenex. but you can kind of use this to dab, dab, dab and keep going. So I would encourage you to find another use for your socks, but I also don't want to say that you have to darn absolutely everything. There are some points where, you know, there are going to be more worn areas than safe areas. And I think at that point it is completely appropriate to give up on a sock.
Mm-hmm.
So Judy says, what sort of needle are you using? It looks curved. It is not curved. This is what I would call an ergonomic needle. It is a needle that I have stitched with so much that I have accidentally bent it a little bit. You certainly do not have to use these. In fact, if you are trying to do straight rows of stitching, it can get a little confusing because of the slight bend in the needle. I would suggest that you use a straight needle, because if you want to do long rows where you just go from one end all the way to the other, a straight needle will help you stitch straight. A curved needle, you know, most of mine are curved at this point from just holding them too tightly as I work, but it is not on purpose by any means. Jean says, would you add fabric on the inside to save the sock? You could. I've certainly seen a lot of good toe repairs where people will add a little bit of fabric. I think if you have a flat area, it can be a really good repair. If you have a knit fabric, if you have a stretchy fabric, that will be better because your wool sock is inherently really stretchy. And if you're stitching something that is really, you know, not stretchy to a stretchy thing, it's going to be very complicated. But I would encourage you still to use a darning egg or something. If you're adding fabric, you just want to hold that shape so you know that when you're done, it's going to be a comfortable foot shape.
I'm going to go back a little bit because Teresa had said that it's an amazing way to fix socks. Thank you. How do you recommend to fix the sock if the hole is in the toe area?
Thank you. I would love to tell you. I thought that this, it does. Great. The sock does have a hole in the toe area. So you can see that right there. I would say we are going to use a really similar method. But you can see, because this is cotton, it started to run really easily. So in this area, it's going to be more important when I do my stitches all around on all four sides to make sure that I've really caught the loops here, that I've prevented this from running further. So as to what that might look like, I probably wouldn't use wool thread to repair a cotton sock, because I tend to wash my cotton socks in hot water. And that is a moment when I would worry about it shrinking. If I had, you know, two different materials that want to be cleaned different ways, I could create more trouble in the long run. So I would probably try to use maybe embroidery thread for this, or if I could track it down, like a nice sort of cotton thread that's the same weight as this. This is basically the weight of sewing thread. It's pretty fine. So I might even consider sewing thread if I had something appropriate. So I'm going to anchor my tail kind of far away. I know I've got this seam that's going to be really stable. So I'm going to stitch into that seam until I get to the hole, feeling confident that I have anchored my tail in a secure area. And I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail that I could weave in when I'm done. So as I'm working here, I'm going to try very hard to stitch into the loops of the knit. We've talked about Swiss darning before, where instead of weaving back and forth, you use loops. You add in a series of loops. I wouldn't do that particularly unless I had a thread that was about the same weight. If I tried to add in loops with this big thread when the original material is made from a really fine thread, I would quickly wind up with a really bulky repair, and I think it would get really unwieldy really quickly. So instead, I'm going to use a running stitch, but I'm going to focus on these loops so that I know I've secured the surrounding area. Because it is really fine, I'm going to use smaller stitches. And I am just trying to grab either side of the loops right here. I am using my fingers as a darning egg for this step, just so that I can adjust them and punch out a different area, stretch it a little bit when I'm looking at it. But when I switch to darning, I'm probably going to switch to using that mandarin orange I brought because I think I would want my other hand at that point in time. And then the other thing I want to show you about toe areas is how they get really stretched out, particularly if you have continued to wear the sock after the hole has appeared, as I did with this one. So you can follow the line of the knit stitches and you can see that it's really not straight. It's pretty curved. Where the hole is, it kind of bulges out, and we want to fix that with our repair. We don't want to just let it happen. So I'm going to stitch really straight up the line of this knit stitch as I go, and I'm going to do the same when I come down here. And then when I make my repair, I'm going to try to keep this really straight of grain. I'm not going to pull these two edges together and stitch them, but I'm going to use a little bit more tension in my stitching in the area where the knit stitches are distorted, with the hopes that this will just create something that, you know, is similar to what it was when I first started. You can see over here, these rows of knit stitches are still pretty straight, so I believe the sock wants to be like that. So. I might actually switch to my mandarin orange right now. I can have my other hand. Another reason why you want something in here is because I don't want to accidentally stitch the front of the sock to the back of the sock as I work. You know, even if you are really confident that you can sort of hold this in the right way and that it won't get distorted, I have stitched too many things to themselves to skip this step. So I am just following this row up the sock. I'm using small knit stitches or small running stitches. Go. And I'm doing the same right here, where I'm trying to catch just little paired loops. There, not sure the video quality is quite good enough for a cotton sock, but I've also got this toe seam right here. I'm sort of following that down because I know that that's going to be a pretty stable area. So it might not be a perfect square that you are outlining, and that is not a problem. And then I'm going to come down following another one of these knit stitches. In this area, I'm trying to hold the edge of this hole kind of secure as I work because it is moving around a lot. And so I think we're almost ready to switch over maybe to just talking, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit of what I do in this zone. You can see there's a lot of space in this hole. Sort of pulling this in together is not necessarily going to be the easiest thing. So I'm going to focus on how it looks up here and just try to let that be my guide. I can see that we've lost one row of knit stitches there, one row right there, one row right there, that row's broken. Similarly, on this side, we've lost about 1, 2 rows. So I don't need these to touch. We are missing a good 5 or 6 rows in here, but I'm just going to try and let this width dictate this width. So I'm going to stretch the sock a little bit over until this area is about the same. And then when I make my stitches, I'm going to pull a little bit more than I did in the heel. Because I don't want it to be too big. And we sometimes refer to this as dimensional stability. A knit stitch isn't really stable in either direction. You can really pull them. They often stretch in 2 ways. So I'm trying to create dimensional stability in this otherwise kind of loosey-goosey area. I've got, this area where I've got a run. I'm just going to do a big stitch over that. I'm just going to treat it the same way I'm going to treat a hole. And so what I might do is hold this on one side and kind of tug it to make sure that I don't have too much excess in the stretch. So I'm not going to make you watch this as I slowly work my way up this hole. I think we are maybe ready to stop the recording and switch over to just question and answer and free talk. I see a question from Jill, and